Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Social Work, SOSW, Diploma Programs, Postgraduate Diploma in Social Work Counselling, PGDCOUN, MSW-001 Origin and Development of Social Work, Block-1 History of Social Work, Global Scenario, UNIT-1 History of Social Work in the Americas.
Introduction. Increasingly, we live in a global village. In this context, international social welfare cuts across national and regional boundaries, with an ongoing emphasis on developing the social resources and mechanisms that are necessary to deal with the human consequences of interrelated social, political, and economic circumstances. Watts, 1995. International social work, then, focuses on the organized practice of the profession in different parts of the world, including the different problems and challenges they face, and the different roles they assume and methods they use to address them. Even within one country, social workers can take on so many different roles that it is hard to define exactly what they do, and what the profession is. As we will see, historical influences in different parts of the world have shaped the specific nature of social welfare and social work. The notions of universal influences, those shaping issues across cultural and national boundaries, and culturally specific ones, characterized by the particular circumstances in any given society, must both be considered in building an understanding of our modern-day profession. In this unit, we will overview factors shaping the evolution of social welfare and social work in selected cities in North and South America. In the process, we will have the opportunity to examine differences that emerge in so-called developed and developing countries, and to look for common ground amongst them. The developmental perspective, as expressed in a 1986 United Nations document on social welfare, is predicated on the maximization of human potential and based on the mobilization of all segments of the population for the resolution of social problems and the attainment of social progress. This new vision of social welfare contrasts sharply with earlier formulations, which focused on enabling certain population groups to overcome what were primarily perceived as individual or group shortcomings. 1995:4. Following its 2005 World Summit, the director of the Division for Social Policy and Development at the UN reaffirmed, quoting from its outcome document, that people have the right to live in freedom and dignity, free from poverty and despair, and that all individuals, in particular vulnerable people, are entitled to freedom from fear and want, with an equal opportunity to enjoy all their rights and fully develop their human potential. Counselling, 2005. It has not always been so, and even today, considerable differences exist across cultures regarding how problems in social welfare should be defined, and how, through social work, they should be addressed. An overview of historical influences within and across cultures may help us understand why historical milestones in the development of social work and social welfare. Social work and social welfare in specific societies have developed in the context of broader, global historical influences. Many of these originated in ancient societies of Europe and Asia, and can be traced in time to the period before the Common Era, BCE. Robert L. Barker, 1999, participating in a project sponsored by the National Association of Social Workers, NASW, and the Council on Social Work Education, CSWE, celebrating the first 100 years of professional social work in the United States, provided an overview of these influences. Significant dates and events, intended to provide the broadest possible chronology of social work history, 1999, and preceding major developments in the Americas include BCE 2500, the Books of the Dead, Egyptian papyrus scrolls, were placed in many pyramids spelling out a king's duties, including care for the sick, hungry, and homeless. BCE 1750, King Hammurabi, in Babylonia, issued a code of justice requiring that people help each other in times of need. BCE 1200, in Israel, Jewish people are told that their faith requires them to help the poor, elderly, disadvantaged, widows, and orphans. BCE 530, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, teaches that love and charity for others leads to enlightenment. BCE 500, philanthropy, or acts of love for humanity, is introduced in Greece, where citizens are encouraged to donate money for the public good. BCE 300. In China, Confucius declares that humans are bound to each other by gen, expressed through the social act of helping others in need. BCE. 300. Prince Asoka of India endows hospitals and shelters for both people and animals. Van Wormer, 2003. BCE. 100. The Roman tradition wherein the wealthy provide free or low-cost grain to all citizens is well established. CE. 30. Christian teachings emphasize the importance of giving to those who are less fortunate. 400. In India, hospitals, or facilities providing shelter for the poor and disabled, are established. 542. Hospitals similar to those in India are established throughout China and the Middle East, and spread to Europe. 650. Muslims are told that paying zakat, a purification tax, to care for the poor is one of the 5 pillars, duties, of Islam. 1100. The Roman Church declares that rich people have a moral and legal obligation to support the poor. 1215. The Magna Carta, in England, establishes human rights, but only for the nobility, privileged class. 1348. Partly because of the bubonic plague, which killed nearly 1/3 of the population, European feudalism begins to break down, leaving the poor even more economically vulnerable. 1531. England's first legislation providing relief to the poor is issued, licensing older and disabled people to beg in their own neighborhoods. 1601. The Elizabethan Poor Law is established, lasting for nearly 200 years, and providing a model on which colonial American laws were based. They taxed people to support basic needs of dependent people in their communities, and harshly punished the able-bodied poor. Across time and cultures, it is apparent that societies have struggled with the recognition that not all members have equal access to resources, or even to the basic necessities of survival. Religious and spiritual influences have provided guidance for responding to these needs, drawing on common principles recognizing the importance of compassion for the disadvantaged. Interpretations of the reasons some find themselves in need have varied greatly, with most early interpretations assuming either that certain degrees of poverty were inevitable, or that those who found themselves lacking the basics of survival were of poor character and in need of motivation to improve. Still, through donations, taxation, or legislation, many cultures have developed values and methods addressing the inequities in social orders. Ideas and strategies emerging over time from Asia and Europe shaped the development of social welfare and social work in the New World, where colonial influences competed with indigenous peoples to shape emerging social orders. Development of social work and social welfare in North America. In North America, the social welfare policies and practices in the United States and Canada have been shaped by many common influences. Chief among these have been the social, political, and economic practices derived from Europe, and the United Kingdom in particular. In Canada, French influences also were significant, and led to the development of diverse practices within a common national context. United States of America. Social work education in the United States was formalized a little more than 1 century ago, when the first lectures to persons working with the poor were offered at the School of Social Economics, in Chicago, Illinois. Still, as L. Diane Bernard, former dean of the College of Social Work at Florida State University wrote, "The sick, indigent, orphaned, elderly and destitute have been with us from the start, and the treatment of those in need ranged from cruel to humane depending on the qualities and capacities of those responsible for addressing their needs." 1995:7. As the American colonies became established and began to prosper, the social contexts and problems faced by their citizens also became more complex. Bernard provides an excellent summary of both the context of and response to these problems in the early history of the U.S. Because the population was small and the resources were plentiful in the beginning years, poverty and dependency were viewed as both unusual and temporary. Almshouses and workhouses became the warehouses for all those who either could not or would not be productive. Before long it became apparent that this was neither an effective nor a profitable solution. Voluntary societies emerging primarily from religious groups were developed for the relief of various categories of the poor and unproductive. With very limited public provision, the number and variety of these voluntary organizations became extensive. 1995:7. Barker's 1999 milestones highlight some of the key steps in the evolution of social welfare and social work in what would become the United States of America. 1624, Virginia Colony institutes laws providing for the needs of disabled soldiers and sailors. 1642, Plymouth Colony, based on the Elizabethan Poor Law, enacts the first such legislation in the New World. 1650, the Protestant work ethic, emphasizing self-discipline, frugality, and hard work becomes prominent, justifying those who adopted its view to look down upon people who are unemployed or dependent on others. 1692, Massachusetts introduces indentured servitude, providing that homeless children could be placed with other families who could require them to work for a period of time to pay for their care. 1776, the U.S. Declaration of Independence is signed, promoting freedom for everyone but the slaves. 1787, the U.S. Constitution is adopted to promote the general welfare, moving social welfare into American political discourse. 1813, child labor laws are passed in Connecticut, requiring that factory owners teach reading, writing, and arithmetic to children working for them. 1830, the National Negro Conventions meet to begin discussions about civil rights, health, and welfare for people of color and women. 1843, the New York Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor is established, and thereafter imitated in its emphasis on abstaining from alcohol, becoming self-disciplined, and developing a work ethic as ways to end poverty. 1848, feminists meet to begin establishment of women's rights to vote and receive equal opportunities for education and employment. 1870, social Darwinism gains influence, supporting the view that poverty was a natural part of the human condition, and that helping the poor made them lazy. 1874, the first charity organization society is established, at first giving only advice, and not direct financial aid to the needy. Charity organization societies, COS, were originally developed to bring order and organization to the extensive private and religious responses to the disadvantaged. Bernard, 1995. The philosophy was to give everyone a chance to be able to stand on their own, with those requesting aid being classified by the volunteers as either deserving or undeserving, based on whether they were judged as being willing to help themselves. As has proven true over time in efforts to mount social work responses, it was often been the economically fortunate who volunteered to rehabilitate the poor through the power of personal influence. 1995 is to 8. 1886, the first U.S. settlement house, modeled on earlier efforts in the UK, is established with the goal of eliminating the distance between socioeconomic classes by locating housing for the poor in working-class neighborhoods. Settlement houses initially provided day nurseries for working mothers, health clinics, and classes in dance, drama, art, and sewing. Van Wormer, 2003. Eventually, they became more politicized and, rather than looking down on the poor or assuming that by setting a superior example the problems of the poor would be resolved, they began to focus on the needs and desires of those with whom they were working through advocacy and social change. We found ourselves spending many hours in efforts to secure support for deserted women, insurance for bewildered widows, damages for injured, machinery, operators, furniture from the clutches of the installment store. The settlement constantly acts between the various institutions of the city and the people for whose benefit these institutions were erected. John A. Adams, 1910, in Van Wormer, 2003 is to 165. 1895, Chicago School of Social Economics, often recognized as the founding center for modern social work, begins offering lectures to persons working with the poor. 1900, the term social workers is coined by Simon Patton, who disputes with Mary Richmond whether their major role should be social advocacy or the delivery of individual services. Van Wormer, 2003 is to 162, drawing on Specht and Courtney's 1994, Unfaithful Angels, How Social Work Has Abandoned Its Mission, acknowledged that arrangements for dealing with the poor that emerged after the feudal but before the modern era could be classified as the 4 petaseconds. These were patronage, piety, poor laws, and philanthropy. Patronage involved boosting one segment of society, often a minority group, into prominence and, in so doing, into enhanced political and economic power and self-sufficiency. Piety was the religious aspect of serving the needy, often as an expression of moral duty. The poor laws, reflecting the imposition of middle-class values and standards of character on the needy were, according to Specht and Courtney, both mean-spirited and means-tested, and often clouded with undesirable or stigmatizing associations. Private philanthropy involved voluntary financial donations as a preferred alternative to mandatory public relief. All predated the emergence of formal public welfare in the United States. 1915. Abraham Flexner issues his report declaring that social work is not yet a profession because it lacks a written body of knowledge and educationally communicable techniques. 1917. Mary Richmond publishes Social Diagnosis, influenced by the work of Sigmund Freud, and emphasizing an approach to client problems based on understanding their inner lives and familial environments. 1933. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaims a New Deal for Americans, establishing major social welfare programs responding to poverty and unemployment. 1950. The Social Security Act of 1935 is amended to include children and relatives with whom needy children are living, and to aid permanently and totally disabled people. 1955. Rosa Parks, a black woman, refuses to move to the back of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, sparking the modern civil rights movement. 1960. The NASW adopts its first code of ethics. 1964. U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson establishes the Great Society programs, and the Civil Rights Act makes racial discrimination in public places illegal. 1965. More Great Society programs, providing for medical care, the needs of older Americans, and children's education, are established. 1990. The Americans with Disabilities Act makes it illegal to discriminate against disabled people in any business employing more than 15 persons. 1990. The Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act provides funding for prevention, intervention, treatment, and community planning in relation to HIV, AIDS. 1996. President Clinton signs into law the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, restricting or eliminating many entitlement programs for poor people, and replacing them with more temporary aid designed to promote independence. A simplified understanding of 20th century social welfare in the U.S. can be summarized as the continuation of debate regarding whether the poor are caught in a trap of their own making, from which they should be required to work their way out, or are casualties of a society where income and opportunities to obtain it are unequally distributed. As Barker's milestones have illustrated, the trend over time has been to provide more forms of social welfare to the disadvantaged, while continuing to struggle with the involuntary distribution of financial resources through taxation. Social workers remain advocates for social change, addressing their clients' needs while providing band-aid solutions to immediate problems and concerns. Canada. Canada shares many historical influences with the United States, and its development has in many ways mirrored major events in its neighbor to the south. As Lightman and Riches wrote, 2000:179, to the outside observer, or even the casual visitor, Canada looks remarkably similar to the United States, modern high-rise buildings standing on wide streets, big expensive cars and refrigerators, and lots of wide open countryside. These similarities, however, are deceptive, as their respective social welfare systems differ substantially. The dynamic tension between these two states aids us in considering whether and how social welfare policies can in fact be indigenized, in a world of multinational corporations, mobile capital, and seemingly irreversible globalization. 2000:180. For Allen, Canadian welfare can be defined most simply as payments to the poor, given as a last resort because they are poor. 1993, S202. Canada has a long history of public welfare programs, jointly funded through public and private sources, Hopmeyer, Kimberley, and Hawkins, 1995. These include programs in health, personal, and social service delivered through federal and provincial governments. Before its establishment as a nation in 1867, social care in English Canada had two major thrusts. One of these, in the Maritime Provinces, was modelled on the English Poor Laws, and the other, in the Upper Canada, now Ontario, placed responsibility for charity on individuals, families, and private charities. Colonial influences played a part in shaping the social welfare context early in the 19th century. Bullets Here and Throughout, adapted from Barker, 1999, and Like Man and Riches, 2000. 1840. Britain abolishes slavery in all its colonies in the Western Hemisphere. 1864. French sociologist P.G.F. Le Play completes the first scientific study on poverty, its extent, causes, consequences, and possible solutions. While the initial development of Canada's social welfare state can be traced to the 30 years following its confederation as a nation in 1867, the idea that the primary function of government is to make a good life possible is as old as Aristotle. Wallace, 1950-383. In Canada, as elsewhere, the Industrial Revolution forced changes in assumptions about self-reliance and independence, as the economy shifted from rural and agricultural to urban and industrial. While frontier conditions emphasized the value of self-reliance, looking down on those who could not provide for themselves as lazy or weak, relatives, friends, or private organizations would at least keep them from starvation. The notion that the Lord helps those who help themselves was considered appropriate from both a religious and economic point of view. 1950-386. Even as it became apparent in the explosion of the urban population that work was not available to everyone who wanted it. As early as 1881, the idea that no one in Canada who was willing to work need want for bread was characterized as an illusion of the past, and support began to develop for the view that government ought to make some provisions for the relief of the poor. The proposal encountered criticism that this would remove opportunity for the exercise of moral virtues such as parental devotion, filial piety, and Christian benevolence, and might also have the unfortunate result of discouraging private alms giving. 1950-387. Churches openly rejected the idea that the state could provide better than they, falling back on the biblical injunction that the poor we have with us always, and regarding views on the causes of poverty, seeming more interested in the sins of individuals than those of society. 1950. Considerations regarding whether social welfare could be addressed exclusively through family and community, as compared to the larger state, first took form in the debate over mandatory, publicly funded schools. Some argued that it kills the sense of duty in the parent, who is naturally bound to educate, as well as to feed and clothe the children whom he brings into the world, while experience seems to teach that what is gratuitous is less valued, and that attendance is better with a moderate fee. 1950-385. Over time, responsive in part to European advances in social welfare, attitudes began to change. It was fitting, people came to believe that government should intervene to prevent men and women from dying of hunger in the street, whether or not their destitution were their own fault. 1950-391. The demand for radical reform gathered momentum by 1900, calling for state action to combat problems in old age, unemployment, poverty, and labor relations, and setting the stage for the emergence of professional social work. Here again, the Canadian experience was influenced by developments in the U.S. 1919, the 17 schools of social work in Canada and the U.S. formed the first organization promoting uniform standard for education and training, eventually named the Council on Social Work Education in 1952. 1926, the Canadian Association of Social Workers, CASW, is founded. The period of compensatory liberalism, Eden and Mollett, 1993, from 1941 to 1981, saw the construction of Canada's domestic social welfare net. During this time, Canada differed from the US in paying more attention to social welfare and issues related to distribution of income. It co-occurred with a global economic expansion following World War II, lasting from 1950 to 1974, and was largely a period of national growth. At the same time, an indirect consequence of the industrial base for the economy was the displacement of those left behind in the workforce. Ultimately, concern for their needs must be confronted. 1935, the Canadian welfare state begins, in the height of the Great Depression, with passage of the first unemployment insurance legislation, becoming, in 1940, the Unemployment Insurance Act. 1943, the Mars Report formalizes guidelines for the Canadian post-war welfare system. 1944, the National Housing Act is established. 1945, Family Allowances, a system of universal, non-taxable child benefits payable to the mother, is passed. 1952, Old Age Security, OAS, is introduced, providing universal, non-taxable benefits to every senior over age 65 who meets residency requirements. Among these programs, children's benefits were paid at modest levels, never intended to be sufficient to raise a child, while payments to seniors were more substantial and, when combined with related benefits, were designed to keep Canadians whose own resources were inadequate out of serious poverty. Lightman and Riches, 2000. The 1950s saw modest progress, mainly through provision of healthcare through hospitals. Services of the welfare state peaked in the 1960s with the provision of three key programs. 1965-66, three key programs, the Canada Pension Plan, CPP, the Canada Assistance Plan, CAP, and Medicare set the high water mark for social welfare provision. The CPP was publicly funded, drew on funds contributed by the future beneficiaries, and was based on work history, with benefits based on the average industrial wage. The CAP was Canada's basic public assistance program. Eligibility was formally determined on basis of need alone, meaning that benefits were an absolute right, rather than a conditional entitlement. Workfare, requiring demonstration of effort in return for benefits, was prohibited. Lightman and Riches, 2000. Medicare offered universal coverage of all services deemed medically necessary to all Canadian residents without user fees. Consumers have complete freedom to choose their own doctors, and to change them at will. The issue of food poverty, people being unable to acquire enough food to meet their basic nutritional needs, returned to Canada in the 1980s with the rise of food banks. Lightman and Riches, 2000. These were non-profit agencies which collect, store, and distribute surplus food either directly to hungry people or to emergency relief programs. 2000:184. As of 2000, there were 698 food banks in Canada, providing not only emergency service, but standing as an institutionalized backup meeting social needs. Hunger has been documented among women living in families, schoolchildren, and the aged. 1985, the Canadian Health Act provides for universal comprehensive health care. Since 1990, governmental policies have reflected a general retreat from the prior concepts of the welfare state. Lightman and Riches assert that people's entitlement to benefits is directly related to their capacity to sell their labor power in the marketplace. 2000:180. Quoting Esping Anderson, they observe that entitlement rules are strict and often associated with stigma, and benefits are typically modest and means tested. The consequence is that people's right to survive outside the market is at stake. In the next section, we will examine how these conclusions apply to the history and current state of social welfare in South America. Development of social work and social welfare in South America. In our brief examination of South American social welfare and social work, it is important to begin by acknowledging that the primary European influences derived not from the United Kingdom, France, or Germany, but primarily from the Hispanic Iberian Peninsula, specifically, Spain and Portugal. Because the cultural and political structures of these two states, at the height of their powers in the 16th century, were largely transplanted to their colonies in Latin America, we will examine their impact on the societies they fostered in the New World. They were, substantially, authoritarian bureaucracies, whose power elite, landowners, industrialists, clerics, and military officers, were not very eager to change a social system which had been and was working directly for their benefit. Resnick, 1995:66. 1494. Monarchs of Spain and Portugal accept the Pope's territorial division of the New World. The goals of Portuguese settlement were twofold: to create a colony that would enrich the crown by its exports, and to spread the Christian faith. Skidmore, 2004. During the time of Brazilian settlement, Portuguese society was strictly hierarchical, led by an aristocracy exercising its power under a hereditary monarch. The most important social unit was the family, followed by one's network of friends. On this basis, the society valued family and personal friendships over merit, making it nearly impossible to work one's way up from the bottom. This culture was transferred substantially to Brazil. Slavery, which lasted until its abolition in 1888, was more massive than anywhere else in the Americas, and essential to propping up the inequities of the resulting economy. Because it was used to justify negligence of public education, the peoples and economies of the region were delayed in the social and political developments that fostered change in neighboring societies. In Argentina, a country of diverse native groups and immigrants, a rich culture developed based on God, family, homeland, and freedom. Spanish and Italian influences merged to create a concept of freedom based on the spirit of the gaucho, the cowboy of the pampas, who struggled to maintain his cultural identity and his spiritual connection to nature and who was nearly exterminated while trying to resist foreign domination of those living in the cities. Cairo Tajali, 1995:90. The influence of the colonial era lasted late in Brazil, largely because the democratic transitions taking place in North America in the 1700s were not replicated in the South. Compounded by the racist legacy of slavery, institutions did not begin to modernize until the 20th century. Skidmore, 2004. From the 1880s through the 1920s, a positivist view of social science was fashionable in Brazil, contributing to a medicalized form of social thought that diagnosed degeneration as the primary social illness. Borges, 1993. This was a sense that the past was better, that the present was declining or falling away from a more perfect type, resulting in a loss of status, of place, or of distinct energies. 1993. 236. Specifically, it represented the inevitable historical process in which pure conquering races, through mixture with inferior races, lose their special qualities and energy. 1993:236. On a micro level, families were thought to be subject to hereditary psychiatric decline in which, over as few as 4 generations, they would go from alcoholism to imbecility and sterility. Like countries in Asia and Africa, Latin America was long considered part of the developing world. Resnick, 1995. However, there were 2 distinguishing factors to the region's development: its dependency on the US, and the rise of military dictatorships with the resulting sense of living through a period of social, political, and economic decline. While other third world peoples express optimism as to their future self-determination, Latin Americans, particularly the younger generation, are rebellious, and, above all, skeptical of developmental promises. 1995:68. As a result, many believe that abolishing mass poverty and achieving social justice cannot be attained without liberation from foreign control. These influences have led social workers to realize that transformation, rather than development, is the necessary route to meaningful improvement in social problems. This, in turn, led to a reconceptualization of social work. 1925, the first South American School of Social Work is created in Santiago de Chile. 1930, the Argentine Social Museum approved a proposal creating the School of Social Service, offering the first professional social work curriculum. 1945, the first Pan-American Congress of Social Service was held in Chile, where curriculum standards were framed. Initially modeled on U.S. educational and professional practices, emphasizing casework, group work, and community organization, Latin American social work over time moved away from these and towards conceptualizations better matched to indigenous social realities. Following the Cuban Revolution in 1953, and the emergence of the Allende regime in Chile in 1970, social workers were unable to decide whether the social change they thought essential should be achieved through reform or revolution. A 1971 statement from the United Nations on Training for Social Welfare captured the tension between struggling within existing systems and working to change them. Social work, and consequently social welfare, must be freed from dependence on imported conceptions and techniques. It must further revolutionary change in social structures and power relationships, rather than limit itself to helping its clientele to function better with a non-viable social environment. In Resnick, 1995:72. Between the mid-1960s and the mid-1970s, acknowledged in social work education as the reconceptualization period, Latin America stopped searching for answers from Europe and the US. and engaged in the discovery of its own authentic potential to become a free continent. Tarjali, 1995. From this perspective, two basic schools of thought emerged, the functionalist and the historical materialist. Resnick, 1995. Functionalists argued that the social workers should contribute to the development of their countries and the achievement of social equilibrium by attempting to eliminate social problems and dysfunctions. Historical materialists argued that the role of social workers is to help the poor overcome their oppression and marginalization, partly through Brazilian educator Paulo Freire's notion of conscientization, and awakening of consciousness. Essentially, this implies gaining a realistic awareness of one's place in nature and society, developing a sense of one's own dignity, and using critical assessment and logical action to achieve transformation. 1976. Military rule ensues in Argentina, leading to the abduction, torture, and killing of more than 12,000 citizens. The report from the National Commission on the Disappeared indicates that many of those who were taken were blue-collar workers, 32%, white-collar workers, 17.9%, professionals, 10.7%, and teachers, 5.7%. As expected, there was no tolerance for the previous conceptualization of social work within the new social order. Many social work educators, as well as practitioners, were dismissed from their educational positions, persecuted, jailed, or killed, while others moved to other parts of the world. Tarjali, 1995 is to 98-99. 1978. The Argentine Council on Social Service Education is created. Since 1983, after many years of military repression and governmental control, social work has been in a period of professional and educational reorganization. The quadruple-digit inflation and negative economic growth rates in Argentina, coupled with massive foreign debt, have led some social work educators to question the whole concept of freedom within the economic restrictions imposed by foreign lenders. In 1985, 4 out of 10 Latin Americans live below the poverty line. Still, in 1992, Maria Lorena Molina, president of the Latin American Association of Schools of Social Work, proposed that professors speak up against economic, political, and social injustice, both within and outside the classroom, and create appropriate conditions for students to get adequate knowledge and values in order to commit themselves to the search for human dignity and equality, without discrimination regarding diversity. Resnick, 1995 is to 79. Social work and social welfare continue to be at the core of tensions in creation and maintenance of just societies, and in the equitable distribution of resources to meet basic human needs. Conclusion. The history of social work and social welfare in North and South America share common histories in that both were largely shaped by European influences. These, in turn, arose in part in ancient Asian and Middle Eastern traditions. On both continents of the New World, colonial influences helped define the nature of well-being, and prescribed responses for inequities that emerged in the distribution of social resources. Differences between the haves and have-nots often involved judgments about the moral character or social status of persons in need, and led to variations in remedies for their circumstances. Often, persons in need were judged to be morally or racially inferior, and were helped by attempts to improve their character and motivate them to help themselves. As societies matured, and in particular, as their economies became less rural and agricultural, and more urban and industrial, efforts limited to character building and charity proved inadequate. Social welfare and social work became increasingly engaged in appeals to the generosity of the advantaged while advocating for change in social structures perceived as perpetuating, rather than relieving human distress. The history of social work education continues to evolve as a response to these varied social and cultural perspectives on common problems in human development. Social workers have taken up the challenge of not only addressing the immediate suffering of those whom they serve, but also critiquing and working to improve economic, political, and social circumstances defining both individual and collective well-being. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.